Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think it is time, and I have the pleasure of opening this book launch lecture, release lecture today. My name is Ed Bernreuter, and I'm head of the Department of Information Systems and Operations. And our faculty member, Jan Mendling, is one of the guys who are running the event today. And I'm very happy that we also have two international guests, Hajo Reyes, sitting in the front row, and Jan Recker, also sitting in the front row, and running and providing the lecture for you today. Okay, everything is a process. This is a very bold statement to begin with, but I myself think that it is true. To what extent, I don't know, but it is very important to understand how businesses work and what they do, what the routines are, and there's a process everywhere. We need to understand how those processes work in order to understand how businesses generate value for the stakeholders, in particular their customers. And we have a textbook here, this textbook is a very successful one. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we're talking today about the second edition of this textbook, Business Process Management, so dealing with business processes in this context, the business context. We have Jan Mendling and Hajo Reyes today, two of the authors presenting, being part of the lecture. Let's look at some measures of success. More than 50 years of experience in teaching business process management. Well, Jan looks very young. Hajo also, and he just told me he's approaching 50. So, and I know that Jan, I know him very well over the recent years. I got to know him even better. He has worked in this area, I think, since the beginning. His dissertation was on this topic also. So they accumulated, all the four authors accumulated a lot of experience, but that does not mean that what they're doing has any impact, necessarily. But it has impact in this case, and we have a few numbers substantiating this claim. So we have 800 citations of the book since 2013. Okay, what does that mean? I can say this is an expressive number, knowing how difficult it is to get impact in terms of citations. So the number of times the book in this case is cited by other work. It has been adopted, the book, by more than 200 universities in 59 countries. This is quite impressive to me. It's a huge, wide range of usage that you can see here. Then we have the MOOCs, the massive open online courses. And here we have 25,000 students who participated in those courses, also a very high and impressive number. A lot of online material covered through, first of all, a group, an instructors group who can subscribe and utilize teaching material. Then we have supplementary online material that can be found online. And last but not least, the book was translated into Chinese, Greek, and Persian. I find this is also a very interesting development to open this book up to other cultures who may not be equally adept or willing to read an English textbook. Okay, I'm approaching the end of my participation, active participation in today's lecture. Just wanted to point out finally that we have Jan Mendling and Hajo Reyes again here today. You see the blue, the pictures with the blue background here on the slide. And at this point, I think, let me pass over this mic to Jan.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thanks a lot for sharing these kind words. And I'm very happy that we're here today to look at this revision of our textbook on business process management. I'm very happy that Hajo Reyes is here, and this also leads me to thank Katrin Fiegel, who is with us today, because actually the opportunity came out of Katrin holding her habilitation defense today, which she gloriously passed, and congratulations, Katrin, for this achievement as well. Unfortunately, the other two authors of this book are not here with us today. Marcello La Rosa just recently moved to Melbourne to take up a position as a professor there. So he's discontinuing Queensland University of Technology as an affiliation very soon. And Marlon Dumas is in Tartu in Estonia, and we'll have to run it without them here today. So Also, thanks to Katrin, it was a specific motivation for Jan to consider to join us here as well. I'm very happy that Jan is with us, not so far anymore from Brisbane, but from Cologne. And he will complement our little summary of what are revisions in our book by his view on where he sees the BPM field going. And I think this is a very excellent pitch for us also then to engage into a broader discussion how this whole topic is evolving. All right, so let me start to give you some more general backgrounds of how things have changed with moving towards the second edition that is soon to be published by Springer. So the scheduled publication date is, depending on where you look online, middle of March or early April. And this new version of the book is substantially extended. So we have 2 more chapters and a lot of more pages, and even a lot more pages that have been revised. The book covers 230 exercises. This is almost doubling the number of exercises that we had. Some topics that we want to discuss a little bit in detail here today that are new additions. That is the DMN and the CMMN standard. We have the redesign orbit. If you haven't heard about this term, you will soon get to know what this is all about. And we have perspectives on monitoring included with recent process mining techniques and a holistic picture of business process management as an enterprise capability. So all these topics are now in the book, and if you look at the chapter structure, this has led also to a revision of the chapters. Altogether now there will be 12 chapters covered in this book, ranging from an introduction of business process management through process identification, 2 chapters on the essentials and the advancements of process modeling. So and then there's process discovery, followed by qualitative and quantitative analysis, process redesign, process-aware information systems, process implementation, process monitoring, and to close BPM as an enterprise capability. So you see these little stars next to these chapters. They're an indication of how much content has been changed and extended. And you see the major changes are in chapter 2, which was a thorough revision. Also chapter 8 has been substantially extended, and the 2 last chapters on monitoring, mining, and BPM as an enterprise capability are also much broader and much more embracing and holistic than the other chapters of the previous edition. All right, so what has stayed the same is that we still look at BPM from the perspective of the BPM lifecycle. So this is the overarching framing of the book, and also many of the chapters directly relate to one of the stages of this BPM lifecycle. Very briefly, there's this process identification activity which connects BPM with the strategic perspective of how the capabilities of the organization are going to evolve. And on this process identification level, we also sometimes speak of multi-process management because we look at the whole organization from a process-oriented perspective. And by picking one of these processes, we can make them subject to this life cycle that you see in the middle. From discovery, creating an as-is process model, to process analysis, identifying weaknesses and strengths and opportunities, to redesign, creating a to-be process model that is going to be implemented with IT systems. And this executable process is then generating event logs that keep track of how the process is actually executed. And with this data, we can analyze how the process conforms or performs. And with that insight, we have a good pitch towards iterating through this cycle again. All right, so how are we going to organize this a little bit in terms of the agenda today? So I will soon pass on the microphone to Hayo Ayers. He has revised chapter 8 of this book, covering a much broader perspective on process redesign, which he's going to summarize a bit for us here. I'll then take over again, talk a little bit about the CMMN and the DMN standard, which are now being covered. Back to Hayu goes variant analysis with process mining. I take over again, look at BPM from an enterprise capability perspective. And well, then we have the fresh perspective by Jan, who wants to discuss a bit with us how this topic of BPM is going to evolve and how are we going to shape this in the future. So Hayu, my pleasure to have you on stage. Please pick up the mic and lead us through the next slide.
Thank you, Jan. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making the time to attend the lecture. I will quickly delve into some of the new topics. Jan showed you the BPM lifecycle, and the chapter on redesign is clearly positioned with respect to this lifecycle in the process redesign phase. Now, we thought when we started revising the book that this would be a chapter where there would be indeed a demand for much more depth, also given the, I would say, given the challenges that many organizations are currently facing, new technologies, but also new behaviors of their consumers, their customers are actually appearing. And for many organizations, it's a question to how to incorporate these technologies or how to adapt to new demands. So what we did is focus on that redesign area and look at how organizations could actually pick up on different redesign strategies. We also made the topic, connected the topic to some of the, let's say, strategic objectives of organizations. I'm using this picture to, well, bring back to memory and actually an old model, which is actually a very interesting model for many organizations to realize how that organizations are at some point often moving from a focus on their products and continuously bringing new features to the products until that moment that it doesn't work anymore, and then they're going to switch, which you can also see as the second wave in this figure behind me, to the stage where they are going to improve on their processes rather than trying to invent new products. And this is not only a perspective that happens for many organizations, that they go through this phase, it's actually also a discriminator for organizations which kind of strategic position they are taking. So if you look at this figure, what you see is that there are organizations focusing on product innovation and others on process innovation. You can easily recognize this when you think of organizations like Apple, which are trying to bring out these new iPhones with these increasingly cool features, even though everybody knows, even when you're an Apple fan, that the, let's say, the delta of the features is actually diminishing with each release of the iPhone. But if you look at a company like Amazon, it is clearly, it's clear that the products they are delivering are not so different from what they have delivered a couple of years ago, but they keep on investing in improving their processes from the moment they develop their one-click ordering button, which seems now every web shop does, of course, but they keep on investing in improving their processes with their drones, their robotization, etc. So we try to use this figure also to position the relevance of redesigning processes. Now, what is the same in the book is the perspective that we are taking at Redesign, and I had many discussions with students, and also instructors are using our book on this particular perspective that we are taking, because we see inherently redesign as a trade-off. Redesign is a trade-off in the sense that it is hardly possible to improve a process across all the dimensions which are maybe relevant for organization. It also explains that redesign is something which is never ends. You may want to adapt as an organization to particular demands right now, but these demands may change, which also means that you want to change your process. So we keep this view on processes that there is actually always this trade-off between time, flexibility, cost, and quality, and you may also want to use other dimensions, and that you have to make sensible choices on what is relevant at this particular time, and that should influence how you would design or redesign rather your business processes. So all the redesign material is still positioned against this background. So a relevant question in this chapter that we try to address is how to redesign. When we think of redesign, it is often something that triggers all kinds of thoughts on that people do creative things. But even creative things, there can be a method behind it. I'm not sure if there's a method behind this particular design, but that is one of the things that we wanted to explain in this new setup of the chapter. What I'm showing you here is actually one of my favorite quotes that I liked to use to cite in my lectures. So I worked as a consultant, and often we went into a workshop and a new process redesign emerged from it. But if you would ask where did it come from, it's actually the ATMO procedure. And then a miracle occurs. Nobody realizes, nobody really understands how processes are redesigned. And I've shown this quote at many lectures, and it really represented for me the state of the art for quite some time. That even though people were redesigning business processes, there was not really a method to it. There was not really a structure to it, which is also sad in a way, because you would never know if you would repeat it, if you would get the same outcome or a different outcome. I don't believe that this is actually true anymore, in the sense that people may still redesign processes in unstructured ways. This is true, but it's not because there are no methods available to do this in a methodological way. So what you see right now is the redesign orbit. It's one of the things that we are now promoting, but it's actually a sort of a scheme to classify the wealth of redesign methods which are currently available. What you're seeing here is an overview of different redesign methods which we are now covering in various depths in the book, and they all the names like design-led, innovation, product-based design, they're all methods that we are dealing with and explaining how these methods deal with the issue of how can we derive an improved process. And we classify these process redesign methods using 3 axes. So one of the axes that you see, and it's the horizontal axis, is that we position transactional process redesign methods, and on the other side, the transformational redesign methods, which gives you an idea of how radical the redesigns are that can be derived with those methods. The transformational ones are aiming at breakthrough innovations, really disruptive designs of processes, where the transactional ones aim to generate incremental changes. You can see the vertical axis. The vertical axis is the axis which helps to distinguish redesign methods which are actually building on the creativity, ingenuity of people who are together working in a group setting and try to stimulate each other and come up with new ideas, which is the essence of many redesign methods which are existing, which contrasts with the redesign methods which are much more analytical in nature, where there are techniques, tools, automated usage of data, which are used to come up with new redesign processes. And then there's the third axis, and that is the third axis which may be a bit difficult to spot here because we played with the best representation, and that was this. You see the inner circle, which represents that actually an internal perspective is taken to come up with a new processes. So the knowledge that is required to come up with a new process is collected within often the organization itself that is redesigning, or whether an outward perspective is taken, or actually a different industry, a different organization, or actually a different interest group is taken as a starting point of coming up with a new redesign. I'm going to give you 2 examples of these redesign methods, but as I said before, all these methods are covered in some depth in the book. So one example I'm giving you now of the transactional side of the spectrum is 7FE. 7FE, the F's and the E's stand for many different phases in this particular method. I'm sorry, I cannot recall all 7 of them, but this is the name that is promoted by a group of consultants who wrote also a book, Justin and Neelis. It's a very popular practitioner's book on business process management. And this method is very characteristic for how consultancy companies are often approaching process redesign. So what you see here in this picture is what is very central is the workshop where a facilitator stimulates people to come up with new ideas on a particular process, and they are mostly the experts working within an organization. And there is a wealth of tools, techniques, and they are also available online to map things, to to actually generate new ideas, like brainstorming, also to draw things and how to do this. And this is actually the most popular way of how many consultancy companies are approaching redesign. What you can expect from this, because it's also taken in eternal perspective, are gradual improvements of existing processes using the knowledge of people who are already heavily involved. It is so popular because it's also a method which is rather successful, because it is rather risk averse. You are making gradual steps towards a better performing process. So in contrast to that is a transformational method which has been developed at QUT. I think the main driving force behind this method is Professor Roseman, Michael Roseman. The method is called NESTT. And even though this is also a method that fosters human creativity and also uses a workplace setting, there's a very clear outward perspective that is being taken. So different industries, different developments of industries are taken as a starting point, and the people in these workshops are really stimulated to not only think of a gradual improvement of the process, so within, let's say, a couple of months, but what also could happen to that process if you would thoroughly rethink it, and how that process could look like if you would project it to 2020, for example. So what you can see on the left-hand side of this picture is actually the layout of a room where the participants move from the right-hand side of the room, the now, where they're also on the wall, the descriptions of what is happening in the process right now, and they are physically have to move during the workshop towards the far side of the room, the future, where there are actually 3 different perspectives. So what could we accomplish if we redesign this process in 20 days? Or if we could redesign this process and deliver a new setup in 20 months? And how would a process, the preferred process, look in 2020? And all kinds of fabulous ways of involving people to really make this journey towards, I would say, a very much transformed process of an existing situation. If you want to look it up, there are beautiful clips of how people really get enthusiastic and get involved in this process. As I said, there's much more to tell, but this is just to give you some examples of the new content that we are covering right here. And at this stage, I'd like to switch again.
All right. Let's turn from the redesign to the implementation phase. In implementation, we typically face the situation that those new process designs that redesign workshops may have been defined, that they need to be developed and implemented, among others, in information systems, but also in an organizational setting. So that means that typically we require to get IT people involved, but we also need organizational training, change management, etc. So these topics can be conceptually associated with taking such a redesign sketch as you see it here in the background onto a level that a business process management system or some other sort of information system is able to support that process and to execute it. And there are 2 important new developments in that area that we cover in this particular implementation chapter in the book. One of them is called DMN and the other one is called CMMN. And these are conceptual representations of let's first start with CMMN, of how case management can be described and represented. So the motivation of this whole initiative towards CMMN comes from the observation that there are various processes out there that are not so easy to fully specify in detail in a fully programmed out and structured way, as we may be used to doing it when we use BPMN. So, and for this reason, the guys behind the CMMN notation, they thought about how can we represent requirements of a processes in a different way, such that we leave those things unspecified that necessarily have to be unspecified, because they only emerge during the execution and working on a particular case. So, and this notation explicitly takes this into account. That means that any sort of case that is described with CMMN can be done in any sort of way, except for the fact that certain of these requirements that are here in the diagram should be obeyed. And the most important notational elements, and there are much more, so I stay here really rather on the surface, but to make you understand what is the idea here, is that we define so-called stages. So stages are these hexagon boxes that you see, octagon boxes that you see here, and they can be used to bundle certain activities that need to be performed, and once they are done, a certain stage in the process is completed. You see here in this example, we are talking about the raw materials that need to be checked for availability. This is associated with the order process that we use as a running example here in the book. And when these raw materials are checked for availability, we want to actually arrive at a particular state that the list of the missing raw materials is completed, and this may be then the starting point that certain other activities need to be done. Here in this case, that a certain supplier number 1 and a certain supplier number 2 needs to get involved. What is still the same as with other notations like BPMN is that we talk also in DMN about tasks. So important elements to describe what are the pieces of work that need to be done are still tasks, and it's the same symbol that you may know also from the BPMN notation. The symbol that I have just crossed by talking over these check for raw material availability is this list of the missing raw materials. This is a so-called milestone. This is this rounded shaped element. And this milestone represents that this is something that we need to achieve. That we need to achieve certain things allows us to specify the what, but we do not necessarily have to specify here in such a diagram the how. So it means any sort of activities that help us to actually compile this list of missing raw materials is fine to arrive here at this milestone. You see here that the activities, they may have these diamond-shaped entry elements here on the left-hand side. So these are the non-filled diamond elements. They're called sentries. And they define that the certain requirements need to be fulfilled. So it means kind of from the activity here that is called the request for raw materials from supplier number 1, having this sentry at the entry point means that actually that this should only be done when something else has been done before, which is connected with this. So it means that actually this request for the raw materials requires us that we first have achieved the particular milestone here, and actually this list of the missing raw materials is available to support this activity. There are also diamond shapes that are filled in black. You see them here on the right-hand side. These are exit criteria, and they define ways of how the process can be completed. Here for this process, you see that there are 2 different activities that actually may lead to successful completion. That's the purchasing of the product from the partner, or it could be the manufacturing of the product. And each of these activities are either of them is fine to complete this process, and they, in this sense, represent alternatives to come to a successful completion here of this case. So the state of this DMMN notation is that vendors and open source providers of business process management systems, that they are continuing to integrate such modeling capabilities into their modeling tools that are associated with the BPMS systems, but they're also already full-fledged implementations, such that you can take such a specification and have that executed on a business process management system. So Camunda is one of the examples of a BPMS that is already supporting CMMN. So there's another notation that was recently defined also by the object management group in the, let's say, in the environment of BPMN. And that is a standard that is called Decision Model Annotation, DMN. And this is also meant to be complementary to BPMN. You see here a little example of a DMN decision table. And such decision tables are very important in various business domains where decisions need to be programmed and explicitly defined. Here in Vienna, we had already several bachelor theses where students who work in the financial industry have investigated how far they can make use of such representations for regulatory sensitive processes, such like anti-money laundering. And I also know from several colleagues that in particular banks are interested in that notation in order to specify explicitly how certain decisions are being taken with these highly regulatory critical processes. In the end, such decision tables like here work fairly simple. You see that there are different rows here in this table defining conditions A, B, C, and D. And there are different columns that refer to different ranges of values of particular input attributes. We have here the input attributes annual income and loan size. And these attributes and particular ranges of these attributes lead to certain outcomes, which is the output attribute grade that you see on the right-hand side. And these gradings of these according to these criteria then are being shown in the output side here of this table. So that means, for example, if we consider a condition that we have an annual income which is less than 1,000, that means we actually hit here several conditions here on the left-hand side. And we also have a loan size that is lower than 500. We would arrive here at the first row that is actually meeting that condition. And the VG indicating that here this is an abbreviation that wants to say very good, that this particular outcome is bound to these input values. You see also from this very example that it can be the case that the definition of these input attributes is not excluding. You see here the ranges are partially overlapping. This is okay, but it requires us that we either define some priorities about the rows and their conditions, or that we indicate a certain hit policy and analyze the table to make sure that they're non-overlapping. So both these conditions are fine, but we need to check this in order to see where the decision table is fine. DMN offers much more. It is also possible with DMN to specify how certain data values and data attributes are associated with certain decisions that then actually feed into other decisions and so forth. So there's also a high-level representation of how certain decisions are made. That's also possible with DMN. And there's also a expression language that is called feel or sfeel that allows you to script within these tables certain conditions and references to certain attributes. So these two things are new, and we also see that DMN, pretty much as CMMN, is being picked up by business process management system vendors, and often the scenarios are then being designed in such a way that BPMN, CMMN, and DMN work together in order to provide an easy and effective way of specifying process for the involved engineers. Right, with this I hand over to Hajo again, who explains a little bit more about monitoring and process mining.
All right. So one other development that we have seen in the recent years, since the book was out, and it started even before that, is the enormous uptake of a technology which is called process mining. Process mining is a field, also a technology where many researchers are working on, and you see increasingly that also vendors are creating products that allow organizations to do process mining. Other than that, companies are really using this technology to take another look at their operations in an entirely new way compared to how they would get in a traditional way. In a traditional way where you have analysts walking around within your organizations trying to monitor, try to understand how processes work. You have now an entirely different approach where actually the data on those processes is taken as an input to determine whether these processes are performing well and also acting in conformance to particular regulations and rules. So we decided also to give process mining and its applications a much bigger role in our chapter. What you see here behind me is indeed the setting of process mining, where an event log, and I will give you an example in a minute, where the event log represents information captured by different IT systems in an organization, where that information which is stored is actually taken as a starting point to do all kinds of interesting, from a process management perspective, interesting actions. So what you see behind me is that you could use this event log in, I would say, the most well-known way to actually discover how business processes are actually unfolding in your organization. We call that discovery. And the first version of the book already showed what the principles are behind techniques that are suitable to automatically discover these processes. But in the new setup, we have widened the applications of process mining to also include performance mining, conformance checking, and also variant analysis. And variant analysis is indeed a very new area where it allows analysts to not only consider how processes are being executed, but also compare different executions of processes with, on the one hand, desirable and on the other hand, undesirable behavior. For example, you could compare process executions where the process ends within a particular deadline compared to process executions that exceed that particular deadline. And variant analysis would then allow you as an analyst to find out what the factors are that actually determine or differentiate the well-performing process executions from the ill-performing process executions. For example, you would be able to find out that particular activities are in some cases actually creating delays, and those would be the activities that you would be able, or that you would be, would be smart to target if you would like to improve those processes. And what we are doing in the book is to show the different techniques which are available to compare different variants of processes to enable organizations to improve their processes. Let me show you briefly the example of an event log. It is interesting that event logs are often represented in a very structured way, where you can clearly see what the event is that is happening, at what time it has happened, and who is actually involved in that process. I know from reality that this information is often deeply hidden in all kinds of IT systems, and it takes a lot of efforts to arrive at these kinds of event logs that you see behind me. But once you are there, of course, and that's the message also of this chapter, there are endless possibilities to gain insights from this data. So let me give you a couple of visualizations of the things that are that you are able to do with the existing technologies. Process discovery is actually the process of turning such an event log into a representation or an abstraction of the process that has generated all that information. So what you see behind me is such a visualization of the process. So instead that people are writing down these process maps, this is something that actually these tools deliver. What is sometimes funny is that people think that this is the desirable outcome, that this is the final thing that you do with automatic process discovery, but it's much more often a stage in finding out which parts of the process are performing well, which ones are not. So it's not an end result, often a visualization like this. It's a step in a journey finding out how a particular process works. So you could use these different techniques not only to show the structure of a process, but also indicate all kinds of different performance attributes of that process. So what you see here behind me, and this is a screenshot taken from the Disco mining tool, what you see here is the use of different colors. You see both activities, color from a light shade of red to a deep shade of red, and also the arrows between them. So what you can make out of these immediately are the activities which actually consume a lot of time on average, and also the transfers of activities between, so the transfer between actual activities which also consume time, which gives you immediately an idea where to look when you want to actually speed up the particular process. So another way of applying process mining, and that is also something that we explain in the book, is that you are not bound to only take a activity perspective on processes. What you see here behind me is a similarly looking map, I agree, but here the activities are, oh, sorry, the boxes are not representing particular activities, they are representing the performance in the business process. So what you see here are handoffs is, I think, the accepted term, handoffs of work between different performers, and in a similar way you can in this way find out which transfers of work are actually consuming a lot of time. So when you take a look at this picture, I think here the threshold is all those transfers of work that take more than 1 day are colored in a red way. So you see these red arcs which show potentially problematic work transfers. And again, this is a could be a starting point to not only fix issues which are currently happening in your business process, but they could also take in as a starting point, of course, for a new iteration of the BPM lifecycle that we showed you, which can be taken as a starting point for actually redesigning those processes. Okay, there is a final transfer, I believe, between me and Jan on our latest and newest chapter.
Right, thanks a lot. So what we felt when we wrote the first edition of the book and when we tried to kind of make the turn and closing it, that there was something not really thoroughly being included in the first edition, and this led to the discussion that we actually have now a 12th chapter that covers BPM as an enterprise capability. And I think this is a very important perspective that we complement here. And it is grounded in the observation that business process management, if you think of it only in terms of methods and technology, that you think it much too small. The diagram that you see in the back is essentially the result of research work from Tonya de Bruyn and Michael Roseman from QT in Brisbane. And Jan van Brocke from University of Liechtenstein has also with Michael taking this further. Towards a discussion, what are the different success factors of BPM, and in how far do they relate to different capabilities that need to be developed and established in the company for making business process management successful. So what we see here is that those topics that are, let's say, the classical BPM topics, these are like methods and technologies, and they form here these two pillars in the center, but they are integrated into 4 other pillars, which are very important for making BPM successful. So on the left-hand side, you see this yellow and the green column. They refer to strategic alignment and governance. So for making BPM successful, we have to think towards how does a one particular specific BPM project, how does it integrate with strategy? But it also requires us to think the other way around. So how can we actually implement strategy using business process management and respective technologies? And to make this work in bigger companies, the green pillar of governance is a very important pillar. Because it requires us to think about what are the different roles that we need in our company and which kind of responsibilities do these people need to have in order to implement BPM and to roll it out in the company. Turning towards the right-hand side, you see this purple pillar, which is called people. And this is also very important. From an, let's say, from a systems engineering tradition, people have very often thought about process implementation as something that means actually that you turn to your IT guys, and they either set up an existing system or they implement certain requirements that you may deliver to them. But indeed, implementation also requires to get people on board. And this is not only in the implementation phase, because those people working in the process, they know in very detail what is happening. They know how the processes work, and they also know where the processes break. And this is important knowledge that needs to be fostered and made available in the BPM lifecycle. So in the column towards the very right-hand side refers to culture, and culture here in this setting refers to organizational or corporate culture, because BPM requires that we need to talk about things from an objective perspective. In particular, just now that how you mentioned all these process mining techniques, these are techniques that create transparency, and often this is what we want, but it is often a roadblock where certain players, certain people in the organization may not be so happy that this transparency actually materializes. And this is a matter of culture to transition from a culture where people build their own little kingdoms and try to hide what is actually happening inside these kingdoms towards a very open way of discussing what things work, what things don't work, and how we can actually move things together forward. So in this model is therefore very important to look at BPM from a broader and a more holistic perspective. We refer in this 12th chapter to some major corporations that have considered all these different pillars. Most prominently, SAP is one of the companies who has been doing very well in approaching BPM from this very holistic perspective. And there are various quotes from the people being involved in this program with SAP, but also from other companies to illustrate what it actually means when we talk about fostering the culture, integrating the people, setting up governance, or achieving strategic alignment here. So in this holistic perspective is also something that can be assessed. Note that when we talk about here BPM maturity, that it is not that we talk about the maturity of one specific process in the company, but we talk about the maturity of the BPM approach. And this little example wants to illustrate a bit what colleagues have observed to be like something like different archetypes of corporations and how they deal with their processes. And these range from companies that, for example, put a lot of emphasis here, following this red line here in the middle, with putting a lot of emphasis on methods and technology, but there are also corporations that put a lot of emphasis on strategy and governance. That's here the blue line. And there are also corporations that more follow here this green line, where people and culture is the way how they try to approach processes. Maybe that's these profiles spark a little bit some ideas what could be typical companies or organizations that you might find associated with each of these lines. Clearly, this can be then also measured. So, and these observations around this 6 factors model brings me to conclude with some 10 principles of business process management that some of our colleagues have compilated. You find here in this list different principles that, well, exactly emphasize this holism. So there's principle number 4. You see also call for purpose, call for simplicity, call for technology appropriation. And what is interesting here, that when you look at these principles, they're less talking about the how. So it means you do not find any principles of using an ERP system or something like this. But it means that we often have to take a step back and think what is really what we need and what we want. And these principles are nicely summarizing this. So one of the co-authors who has contributed here to these 10 principles is Jan Recker, who is with us here today. And this is a great opportunity to hand over to you, Jan. and thanks for sharing with us some perspectives on the future of BPM.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Hayo. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's an honor, really, to be here. And I don't think the eminence of this occasion is actually spread very well. Of course, you didn't do this. You're a humble person. So let me do this for you. The enormity of the success of this book came out a little bit. Yeah, we saw some statistics of uptake and impact and so forth. But I don't think you fully grasp the enormity of this. So not only is it the best-selling and the most widely adopted textbook on BPM. What is most astounding about this is this was created in a space where there were plenty of textbooks. So this was not the first textbook on BPM, and this was probably the 100th, right? And within 3 or 4 years, and it bypassed all of the other contenders that were out there. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is if you look up in Springer, the most published books they ever published, it's right at the top of this, and even in Amazon, across all sorts of textbooks, it's ranking very well. So this is really an authoritative source, and obviously written by authoritative people. And I just looked it up. Apparently 3 of the 4 authors of these textbooks are among the top 12 authors on BPM papers of all time. So it feels a little bit like the High Court, right? So the Royal Court of Business Process Management and me. And if you think there's all these kings out here, then the question is, of course, what is my role here? And I think my role is that of the jester. So those of you that don't know, the jester is a key role at the royal court. He's there to remind the regents of their boundaries, to provide criticism in some sort of funny way. This is why he has the so-called mock scepter. So I can mockingly provide some criticism and some boundaries around what you guys have shared. So that's what I'll do today. So that's why I put up this preamble that I'm actually a really big fan, and I'll gladly have read some of the pages of that book. But I'm here to actually talk about something else. And I'll put it provocatively, why do we care about a textbook on a topic that's dead? Right? So I've spent quite a lot of time on BPM, but also spent quite a lot of time outside of BPM and engaged with the communities that are not our friends, so to speak. And if you follow their thinking and you follow their commentaries and their arguments, and in fact, if you even look at some of the studies that people set out to do, they've actually went out to prove that BPM is dead. And it has been dead for quite a while now. So this is just one of these studies. I only picked this because they actually went and tried to measure this, whether or not this is still alive and active, a topic that anyone would care about. And so in this particular article, it was called a fashion wave that was hot in the 90s and really died off in the early 2000s. Yeah? So why do we care? Why do we put in efforts in putting another 500 pages out on a topic that no one else cares about other than ourselves? And there are other papers, and there's some truth to this, I think. So if you're a BPM follower, I guess you would know that there are these so-called waves of BPM, and they go back to Taylorism, 1920s, the black cars and all this. Then there was re-engineering in the 90s. There was the so-called third wave in the early 2000s, where it led into this notion of continuous improvement, etc. But really, if you think about it, that already is almost 20 years ago. What happened since? Where's the fourth wave of BPM? Right, so if I put this differently, and I say this every now and then, and say, well, have we solved all the problems? What's new? What is there? And of course, there are many, many contenders. So you guys mentioned a little bit robotic process automation. If you read the newspaper these days, it'll all be about blockchains. There's digital business process management, I'm sure. There's digitization, digital transformation, digital revolution, digital disruption, digital anything you want. Yeah, so clearly there are contenders in there that you'll find papers on these topics even. So the question is that it? Is that really the revival and reenactment of process management these days? And obviously I'm here to tell you, well, that can't possibly be it. I don't want to talk about robotic process automation too much. So the picture that we see at the moment in the media, but also in academic papers, is this notion of, oh my God, the robots will come and take my job away, right? You would have seen this. There were some very vocal, very well-profiled people saying the robots will come and take over. The only thing I'm going to say to this is this argument has been made many, many, many times before, for example, in the 50s. This is an article for Harvard Business Review in the 1960s, so it was actually done sometimes in the late 50s, around when the computers come out and take over the office, and an office automation, which was BPM called then, would be happening. And obviously, all the sorts of drama that people attenuated then didn't happen, and in the same way, it's quite unlikely that robots will come and just automate every single business process, no one. So, all right, so I don't think they're quite there yet, but my real question here is, what is this fourth wave of BPM? What could it possibly be, and how do we, as the actual proponents in this field, can we do about it? And there's three things that I think we can be doing. These are some of the things that I engage in, and some others. The first one is, I think we need better tools, which is a funny thing for me to say, but I'm really pointing out to the process mining community, I think we don't have very, very good tools to really understand business processes as they actually happen. 10 years ago, there was a very famous paper, not in BPM, but in some other, in the organizational sciences, which spawned what is called the social materiality movement. And that was one of the pictures that's actually in the paper, and it says, look, we can't think about what people do anymore with also considering what tools they use. And 2006, 7, 8, when this paper came out, they used a screenshot of someone working in front of a computer, but also having all sorts of material artifacts like Post-it notes and so forth. So then they said, look, we cannot separate this anymore. We cannot look at what people do and the actions they follow throughout the process, without also at the same time looking at the technologies they use, be it computer technology, information technology, or paper clips, or what have you. Now, this was 10 years ago. I think this image is even more vivid these days when you think about hybrid reality like we see in Pokemon. In Brisbane, where I used to work, there's this place on the riverbanks, quite picturesque. You can take a walk, etc. And there's just one place there on the riverbank where thousands of people would gather all of a sudden, as of 2 years ago. And I always wondered, why is that? And until I realized it's a Pokestop. So apparently that's where a lot of very beautiful little Pokemon creatures spawn on your iPhone. So there is a physical manifestation of something in the digital world. People gather there physically, they walk there because of something they see on the screen. And this picture I like very much because there are two guys that are playing some sort of tennis, I suppose, but you can't even tell whether they're playing real tennis or whether the real game is happening on that screen in the middle. And the bystander, I'm not even sure what she's looking at, whether she's looking at the people or at the screen, right? So it's really mixed. You can't tell one from the other anymore. So this argument from 10 years ago is even more prevalent today, I think, right? It becomes harder and harder to separate the technical from the social. Now, keep that in mind and contrast that. What are we doing in process mining? We build graphs, usually, not necessarily entirely, but usually of the actions, right? So this is a process mining generated map of some process where some action follows another one, and there's loops and so forth until we reach a stage. Similar graphs we obviously also use in other sorts of disciplines. So for example, in social networks, not in process networks, we build connection between people. But we forget about what it is that they're doing. Now, if you go back to this picture, which is one that we generate ourselves, we looked at the same process by not looking at only the actions that people do, but who was doing that with what tool. An action that someone carried out using some technology, some tool, whether it be a smartphone, a computer, a piece of paper, God knows whatever else. And that's the real process. Many, many, many more connections, much, much more messy, much, much more complex. Something that we would think, if you only look at the process in a classical sense, is a fairly simple thing to do. So Hayo talked a little bit about handoffs. We also looked at the handoffs that occurred, and one of the most interesting findings we had was handoffs don't occur between people anymore. It's not that I take my work and give it to Jan, and then Jan continues. Most of the handoffs don't involve humans at all anymore. They involve computers telling one another while the person in front of it doesn't even notice anymore. When we showed this to the process mining community, we got this response. Well, actually, the process maps are usually pretty large, so we usually try to think of ways of making it more simple rather than more complex. Well, the processes that we deal with are getting more and more complex, and we're building tools that simplify away this complexity and the reality until we get to some toy examples that we can actually reason about. And this is not a complex, modern, hybrid reality type of process. This is a very simple call center process of people trying to solve problems over a phone call, right? So I think we're not doing a very good job there. And as long as we assume that one process is executed within one system and the event logs can only come out of SAP, we're not going to get to actually an understanding or improving the real process that we deal with. The second point that I wanted to say is integrating theory of digital innovation rather than labeling everything digital. What I mean with this is, I think we, as many other fields at the moment, we need to jump on that digital bandwagon. There's basically no way around it, which is a great thing, I think. If you're in information system, this discipline, now we finally have our raison d'etre, we have a reason to be there. We can't think of businesses without thinking of technology anymore. But we're not doing a good job of this. That's not us, that's many of our colleagues as well. The example that I like to take there is Christensen's very famous, very popular theory of disruptive innovation. Well, it's very popular. I'm pretty sure most of you have heard of this. You may have read the book, etc. If you look up the research on this topic, it's been very clear that it doesn't work like this. This theory, in an academic sense, is simply wrong. It's popular, it's been taught about, we use it, we use the same sort of language, the same sort of concept in a lot of our work. And there was an utterly bitter debate ensuing about this particular, and this is just one of the examples. And one of the things that one clever guy said is that the whole dust-up around this debunking of Christensen's theory of disruption is that I wish that people would start to think more carefully about the theory before spouting the relevant buzzwords. That, I think, is a reminder to any field, not just BPM in particular, that we need to be very careful on whose bandwagon we jump on and how do we deal with concepts and we trying to use in our own words. So I don't know what digital BPM is supposed to look like, but I'm pretty sure that we're not going to help ourselves if we just jump on the bandwagons that others very carelessly formulate for us. The bad part about all this is that our field is not very good at developing theory in the first place. So this is some work that Jan and I did, where we looked at a particular subset, obviously, of papers, and we looked at, well, what are the preeminent sort of methods, the preeminent sort of artifacts, the preeminent sort of scientific vehicles that our community is using. And clearly we're artifact-centric. We're good at building tools and new concepts and new methods, etc. Our record on generating, developing, and testing scientific theories is shocking. It's as simple as that. It's absolutely shocking. And that's a problem. It means that there's actually very little capability in our own field to help us get better at that. And as long as we stay in our own boundaries of our field and only talk to the people that we know and trust and so forth, we're not going to get better at this. We have no one to teach us. Right? So we got to look elsewhere. And I think this is a very clear sign. You can see that I grayed out some other bits because I wanted to highlight that contrast. It's a problem. It's a problem especially for an inward-looking field where the community is very strong and very cohesive. But you tend to be looking into one direction if you don't follow what other people are doing. Which brings me, let's get that, to my third point, which is a necessity for BPM as a community to open up, reach out rather than shut out. I think there's no other way for BPM to survive other than becoming more inclusive rather than exclusive, more open rather than more robust, if you will. So that goes back to a very old statement that basically any field these days says we all need to become much more interdisciplinary. Of course, every field, every talk that you go to says the same things, but it holds true for us as well. And the question is, of course, how do we do this? And one thing I wanted to point out here, this is, again, not a problem of BPM, the community as we know it. For example, we spent some time dealing with other people that also have an interest in processes, in process management, etc., maybe not using the same language, and seeing whether they refer to our work. So this is a very recent book, basically got published just around the same time, by organizational scholarship people. 700 pages long, and if you look through it, it's literally got the latest knowledge on process organization, on the way that organizations deal, handle, manage, and improve their processes. It doesn't have a single reference to process mining in the thousands of references it has in there. So clearly, this is not a problem of BPM per se. It's just as much a problem of the other side, let's say the organizational scientists or anyone else that has that problem, that the communities have become so different and so separated from one another that one side doesn't talk to the other anymore. And we know that these guys are not necessarily listening to us, but then the question becomes, what do we do to invite these people in? And you would know that, for example, the BPM conference series is now trying to help this, changing the structure and the format of the conference a little bit to bring some of these people in. We're trying to do that as well, and I wanted to give a pointer here. to a special issue that Jan is involved, myself is involved, and Brian Pentland, who is one of these guys from the other side, if you want. And not only is this a special issue that fits because it invites people to submit papers on this notion of where's the digitalization of business process management, but it's also one of our clear endeavors of bringing and bridging these communities together. And that's the first time in the history of BPM that I'm aware of that we got people that are strong in the computing sciences and the information system sciences and the organizational sciences, that all three sit together at one table and try to make this happen and take a step forward here. So I'll close in saying, and going back to the question about what is the future of BPM, and saying very simply, the future of BPM is whatever we make of it. It doesn't matter what I say, it doesn't matter what the others are saying, it doesn't matter that outside of our community people may think it's dead. If we believe in that there is a future, if we believe that it's alive and well, transformative, digitalizable, effective, purposeful, I don't care what it is, then it's our job to go out and demonstrate this and make this work. We can't let others decide the fate and the future of our field. Thank you very much.
Maybe just say, so I suggest we simply organize this as this. I'm not sure which sort of questions you might have, so there may be different persons being the best ones to answer. Therefore, I think it's good that we all here close by. And I will come to you with the microphone if you have any questions. Or comments, or observations, or whatever. Or Hayu, do you want to ask something to Jan?
I think he did his role as a joker very well. Thank you. What kind of expectations would you have for the special issue that you just announced? Do you have any things that would excite you as submissions to the special issue?
Two, I guess. Number one is actually the topical one. Someone that really explains how these notions of digital innovation fits within process management, whether it's the innovation of process management or whether it's using process management in the context of digital innovation, whatever that may mean. We don't actually know what that term means yet, but if we have submission that can unravel that and show what the place is for processes or whether digital innovation necessarily invokes process change or not, that would be fascinating. The other expectation, the other hope that I have is that we actually will end up having an issue where we have very strong computing papers, where novel artifacts are being produced, demonstrated, tested, and so forth. And we have this very theory-driven organizational scholarship. So when we really have contributions, maybe even in using the same language that they always have, but within the same issue. Yeah, if you think about a paper-bound issue, that I can open this pamphlet and read all three types of papers. Maybe an empirical paper, maybe an engineering paper, and a theoretical paper. How wonderful would that be? Yeah.
All right, I look back into the audience.
Thank you. Sorry, I hope not to make the figure of those who go to the concerts and sing along the singers as if they know the lyrics better. But my curiosity was, I've been teaching for the course on business process management, that process mining is an evidence-based discovery technique, and that workshops were used again as a discovery technique. Now I see in this new book, these techniques tend to shift along the BPM Lifecycle towards the closing of the cycle. So I was just wondering whether this is like a way that to present the techniques are just cross-phase, or as if you're just identifying these techniques as a new replacement for new steps, so to speak.
Thank you. I think, so let me first start with an anecdote, because I was at the WU, I think a year ago, and I had the privilege of sitting in Claudio's room. And I couldn't help noticing that he had our book on his shelves, and I needed to look up something. I was actually writing on the second edition. So I took the book from the shelf, opened it, and I was blown away, because on every page there were thoughts and comments and remarks and underlinings and accentuations, etc. So if anybody knows our book, it's Claudio. So very happy in that respect that you are raising this question. So what I think, if your question is that you, or if your observation is that you see this shift of how we position process mining and much more tie it also to the other phases and the explicit phase of this discovery, I think this is true. It is true in the sense that we also see the shift, that more organizations are already assuming this evidence-based approach as the standard approach, but there is still this contrast. So we do still acknowledge this contrast of these two different approaches, but we do see that process mining is becoming much more connected to these different stages of process mining. It's becoming more of a, let's say, common approach than it was when we first released the book, when it was something which seemed like a niche technique, which is obviously not the case anymore. So I think in that sense, your observation is totally correct. Yeah.
Can I add up on this? Because like one thing that I tend to say when I put up this BPM Lifecycle figure is that, well, what is this? What is this BPM Lifecycle? Who does it like this? Nobody does it like this. It's a didactic device to organize this book. And I think a part of the answer to your question is also that, of course, things are all over the place. And the reason why these techniques appear up so late is also due to the fact that they are in a certain way more sophisticated than some of the other things that come earlier. And they take into account explicitly the availability of such data. And therefore, they make didactically, from my perspective, more sense to have like in the later parts of the book. Katrin, did you raise your hand or? Yeah, right, I'm coming with the microphone.
Yeah, I found the example very interesting on this one book about processes that didn't mention process mining at all. So on one other slide you had your article where you stated that there aren't any theories in the BPM field. So what's in this process book? I don't know it, but there is nothing about process mining. Maybe there are some kind of theories from outside fields?
I guess the short answer is yes, they are. When these communities talk about processes, they build theories of change. Yeah, so Poole, Van de Veen, and others, they build theories about how change happens in organizations. Now, they usually don't use the word business process, but if you look at what they're doing, they look at how the process of an organization change. Right, so they try to find out whether there's certain archetypes out there, etc. So they usually don't care about how we build a method to do any of that stuff. They're just out there to analyze and explain what they see, right? So I know that several of these people, they studied large organizations like BP, how they deal with the critical disasters like an oil leak, etc. and so forth, and how they develop and change the routines they have in place to handle these things. Right? So they do exactly what we do, but they stay much closer to the actual case and the actual process and the actual domain. Whereas the BPM community usually abstracts from that. Right? We don't care whether our business process in the finance sector, in automotive, or in the chemicals industries. We reason about how we manage the processes. And they often theorize about what exactly happened to this process and might this occur in some other process as well. Both have value, obviously. They're very different approaches, but they all deal with the same thing, which is why I think it's imperative that we understand what they are doing just as much as they need to understand what we are doing. And that's a call that we need to give to our own field, and we have to step out and do it to them, because clearly they're not coming to us. We're not going to them yet, so if they don't come to us, right, if Mohammed doesn't go to the mountain has to go to Mohammed. So, and I think that Jan and others, they're actually taking steps to actually go into the hearts of their communities. We've tried for many years to bring some of these communities in, let's say, into the BPM conference here. It doesn't seem to work. So maybe the idea was, well, let's go to their meeting places and their watering holes, and go to their journals and their conferences, etc., and then tell our messages there. Once we've done this, we may fail and we may succeed. Then we are much closer to see whether or not there can be any bridge, right? But for the last 10 years, we all lamented and whined a little bit about, oh my God, it's disconnected and so forth. But as long as we don't do anything about it, it's not going to change.
Change processes, yes. So more questions, more comments.
So I actually have two questions. So one is, what do you think would be the result of that? I mean, what would it help the BPM community to speak to the other people? Just for theorizing, or anything else?
I think, well,
get the mic for you. I must say that Sabrina is actually working on that question.
I think there's two immediate gains. Number one is that our state of knowledge becomes more complete. We look at the same phenomena, and we need to understand all the different pieces and knowledge that are being generated in different fields, and we only become better if we know these pieces of knowledge, right? So that's basically one of our tasks as scientists, to understand fully, holistically, what's happening around processes. They have some very interesting ideas. They have a lot of stuff that we've done as well. Some of these people say we do a lot of these things better, and vice versa. But you know, anyway, any one of the states of knowledge are incomplete without considering the other works. The other one is more an ecological perspective. My personal view, that's an opinion, is the BPM community as we know it here, I think it's too small to sustain. Yeah, it's quite impressive that there are 300 people coming and attending BPM, etc. But in the large scheme of things, that's very, very few people. And if it really is such a universal topic, processes are everywhere, etc., we can't possibly satisfy any demand for new knowledge. It's just too many people. How many accountants or how many finance professors do you know, right? Or anything, or physics, or take any field that you want. So if it truly is to be a discipline of its own, we need to grow. And we're not going to grow by becoming an island and just, you know, sort of, I don't want to use the metaphor here, but sort of breeding within ourselves, really, right? So we've seen that one of the famous hunting grounds for BPM people was always QT. So everyone has gone there, and a lot of people have gone to Eindhoven, a lot of people are going to Vienna, etc. So we know each other very, very well, but that can only happen because there were a few people, right? So we need to grow. And where do we get these other people from? Right? So that's an ecological perspective. Otherwise, I think we would die of starvation, so to speak. I'm still on my jester role, that should be clear.
He's doing very well. Yeah. I believe you had a second question, didn't you? Yeah.
So I have more the, let's say, open questions here with not too explicit answers probably. I was wondering about this digital innovation, even about the terminology. So what I read about it, and it wasn't like a lot, but I don't see where the difference is to any other innovation that we did until now, because I mean, everything was digital in the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years, right? So maybe you have more insight on that topic, but for me, it's just not clear even where this terminology came from, this term came from just now.
It's a wonderful question, and I think the answer is I don't know either. It might, like at the moment, it has the same feeling as many other buzzwords that we've heard before. Right? Digital native is a wonderful example. So apparently there's digital immigrants and digital natives. I'm apparently a digital immigrant because I was born before 1980. Now, again, everyone knows these terms and the distinction. Again, if you look up the research, all this stuff falls apart. So there's two outcomes. Either there is something digital about being digital and something that is fundamentally different. If so, we don't know what that is yet. Or the alternative is, of course, everything that we now label digital is just the same old stuff in, you know, the old wine in new bottles. If so, then we need to demonstrate that. Either way, we got to do some research on this, either to disprove it or to prove it. Now, there's interesting work around this attribute digital. What makes a technology digital versus non-digital? And this uptake, and that's why I started this Christensen work, it's horrible. If you go into marketing and other fields, they talk about digital marketing. There's digital sociology now. There is web ethnography, so studying what people do on the web. No one of them looks at what that characteristic of digital actually means and how that changes anything. So just at the moment, it's just an attribute that we plaster to things. So from that perspective, the papers that I have seen on digital process innovation or digital process management or anything of these sort of conjunction of the terms doesn't stand up to that. So again, but there is interesting work around the notion of why a technology might be digital and hence different. And that would be interesting. We could apply that and see whether that means that process management or any of the fundamental assumptions that we have about doing process management, whether they change. That would be interesting. It was just as interesting to find out that it doesn't, that it's robust against the age of digitalization. Because that would take a lot of fire away from Angela Merkel, who used that term, I think, 30 times in her New Year's Eve speech. So it's everywhere.
All right, I will accept one more questions for the sake of time. So please show me your hands if you still want to comment or get some questions answered. All right, Gustav.
I was coming late, therefore it might be the case that whatever I'm asking was discussed long time before. But I mean, when you see here the question is the future of BPM, the question is BPM a value on its own? I mean, is it something worth to do something with BPM or not? I mean, the question is, what are the values one is providing with some kind of technique? Because processes everywhere. I mean, and processes are in program development, for example. Why do the people from program development using different kind of agile, whatever techniques, but why they don't look in detail at BPM? Because they have other problems, and the values one can provide there are not so important for them. The other question is, why do people from business look very careful at BPM? Because there are certain values one can provide, and one should really look into detail. What are the values you can provide there? Can you prove something? Can you visualize something? Can you use it as a communication tool? I think this is the main question where to work at. This is not a question at the end of the techniques, but the question is, what are the unique selling points at the end one has it? Because, as I mentioned before, processes are everywhere. Processes are in whatever, in election processes, or processes are there on machines, and in many respects, people use very different tools to talk about processes. Therefore, I guess the question is of shaping the value that BPM can provide, whatever this is the way where it can move. And maybe this shaping the thing goes really in the way of going into what is doing finance in detail and how to understand whatever, let's say, systems based on microservices, what kind of processes are between these things that we can understand better, and trying to focus on these values. I mean, just from the observation point of view, just seeing the single slide here, I think the identifying values, I think, is worthwhile. It has, people know what use, but sometimes I hear often the question, what is the next thing, and where we do as a next step. And normally this is not a strong sign of a community, because if the key researchers don't know where it goes and ask questions, it's not a healthy sign. And the question is, who can answer this question? And if it's not the key researcher, it has to be the people which are using it, more or less. Just as an outsider.
Right, I think we have not answered that question in the first part. Maybe let me share a few words. And I want to follow up on something that Jan said when he mentioned Van de Ven. So I turned to org science terminology, and it's one thing that they that the org science community has understood is that there are different types of processes. And they vary in terms of certain characteristics. And those processes that we typically talk about when we talk about business process management are what they call sometimes teleological processes. So it means we want to achieve a certain specific outcome. And there may be different ways of getting there. But why it makes the BPM perspective interesting for these teleological processes is the assumptions that we want to find out the best and the straightest way of getting there. That's a little bit like using a route planning tool like Google Maps for getting, let's say, from here to Cologne. With certain assumptions and certain key characteristics, and saying, I want to be like very fast in Cologne, and maybe the answer to that is that I should take the plane. I want to get maybe like a very scenic tour through the south of Germany. I might take the car, or I might take the train, etc. But the key point is there are different ways of getting there, and this teleological perspective exactly implies that we need to understand the trade-offs in terms of getting towards the goal that we desire. That's the first part of the answer. And I think the second part is that we are dealing with processes in an organizational setting, typically with BPM. And that means that those people that are working on the different tasks and the processes, they're typically agents of the company, so people that are employed for doing their job. And for that reason, their, let's say, everyday sentiments when they're sitting at 10:30 in the morning at their desk approaching the next task that they're supposed to do, that they have, let's say, a very rich spectrum of motivations for doing this and that, or going to the toilet or going to the coffee machine, such that there is an interest in this principal-agent problem of the principals in order to guide the respective agents working on the different tasks in somewhat like a rational way towards achieving the respective goals in an efficient and effective manner. And maybe that explains that in business process management, we are usually implicitly talking about all sorts of processes, but they often share the characteristic that these are processes where we have, for example, handoffs. This is one thing that you mentioned that you also recently investigated. So it means there are different people doing different things, and it is actually the interest of somebody else that these processes come to a desired outcome. Any comments on this? Yeah, follow up.
So I'm really subscribing to this view, this teleological perspective for process management, which means that the field caters for those organizations, those people who become aware that processes can actually be organized in different ways of achieving a particular thing. And this is, I think, something which is now changing more drastically than it has done so far. What I mean is that some processes, even business processes that have been executed until this time, there was no conceivable way of doing things differently in the minds of people up till now or up till recently. Because things are actually becoming or have a much more informational nature, and that digitalization is actually a force which we see around us, there are more opportunities to do things differently than we used to do them. So let me give you a clear example. If you have a tangible product that you are manufacturing that has physical properties, you are constrained to the properties and also to, well, its physical appearance, how to assemble it. But what you do see is that organizations are increasingly able to, for example, not offer the product directly to the customer, but offer a proxy of it, or perhaps a virtualization of that version, or a service that can be used by the client to actually use that product in another environment. So what you see is the opportunities are increasing to also shape particular processes. And I think there's a trade-off if how much you know about one particular type of processes, say manufacturing processes or financial processes, versus the knowledge that there is generally available of organizing things in a particular way, which I think is the core of the process management community. And I think that this reservoir of knowledge is increasingly becoming interesting for other disciplines, where until that point they wouldn't consider of doing things, accounting for example, in any different way than they did it in 200 years ago. So that is my feeling, that the generic, let's say the generic core of BPM is increasingly becoming more interesting for other fields up to a certain point. So that's one thing. What I do think, and that's the other thing that also Jan mentions, is that of course there are implicit assumptions behind our field. There are people involved. As soon as we are talking at processes which can be completely automated, we're talking about computer programming. We're not talking about process management anymore. And this is perhaps not always apparent from, let's say, the label that we use. Processes are everywhere, which also allows people to think of micro elements or fully automated processes. Of course, we cater for a specific area where actually people play an important role. With no people in the loop, I don't think our field is actually providing, or is not the key field that provides answers. And the last thing I wanted to say is your comment, which is also thought-provoking, of course. Is this a viable area when we are thinking about what the major challenges are for our area? So I'm not so pessimistic that we are doing this, and that we are often doing this. It shows that we are at least not, I would say, not a community that wishes to separate itself from other communities. We do think about the connections between other fields, but since there are different connections, I mean, Jan Rekker mentioned organization science, but also the hard computer science, there are different directions in which our field could develop. Do we need to focus much more on the automated part of processes, or much more the human side of the part? We are, in a sense, a field which is in between other fields, which makes it natural, I think, to continuously consider how our field is evolving. So I'm not so as pessimistic as you are, Professor Neumann. I think this is actually a healthy aspect of our field. Would you like to? Yeah.
Just a short comment. I mean, one thing is, again, being provoking. I mean, if humans are playing an important role in business processes, which I completely agree, the question is, why are not humans a real big player in process models? I mean, I will look at other things where humans are there in use case diagrams, whatever, but in process models, I don't see them really. I mean, there are ways of doing it, of course, but it's not the common approach. And the other thing, I think it's certainly very important what to say, tell people about alternatives to do things. And here's also another area which was developed, whatever, year 2000, was design patterns. I mean, design patterns was a wonderful thing because you said, I have here a solution which worked in this setting, and there are known uses here and here and here, and I give it a name. And giving it a name is very important. It's the most important contribution of design patterns, because people afterwards can communicate using this name. This is an observer, this is a whatever, a chain of responsibility, and people know what it means more or less. And it's also would be interesting certainly for doing processes. This kind is having a name for process 1, process B, process C. This approach can work here or there. And I also I'm not really an insider of the process. I don't see this really happening strongly, but it would be certainly great to have it.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to close the open discussion with these observations and comments. And that actually means that I still have 2 things left to say. Thing number 1 is that for those who actually are interested in the book, the publisher was so kind to offer us some discount vouchers. You'll find them in the very back on the left-hand side. In case you're interested, just pick one of them. And the second thing is that I'm very happy that Stefanie is here, because writing a book is a very annoying task for a wife. And I thank you very much for your patience and also your impatience at stages. Great to have your support in all of this. So thank you very much.